Hello kids, today I am telling you the story of Cinderella. Once upon a time when there were still fairy, there were a girl called Cinderella. She lived with her father and his new wife and her two new stepsisters. The stepmother did not like Cinderella very much. Cinderella had to do all the work in the house as the stepsisters were also very lazy. One day a very grand invitation arrived. The prince was looking for a wife and had decided to give a ball in 3 days, time for all the young ladies in the land. The sisters could talk about nothing else. They bought lots of new dresses and many pairs of matching shoes. They made Cinderella curl their hair and iron their ribbons and powdered their noses. Cinderella was so exhausted running around after them that she had no time to look into her own wardrobe to choose what she should wear. In a waft of perfume, the sisters swept out of the door into the carriage without as much as a thank you to Cinderella. She closed the door sadly and went to sit by the fire in the kitchen. I wish I could have gone to the ball too, she sighed. There was a sudden swirl of stars, and there in front of Cinderella stood an old lady with a twinkle in her eye and a wand in her hand. You shall go to the ball, my dear Cinderella. I am your fairy, she said, smiling. Now we must be quick. There is much to do. Please bring me a large pumpkin from the vegetable patch. Oh, and 6 mice from the barn. And you will find 4 lizards by the water bird. Cinderella did as she was bid. With a wave of the wand, the pumpkin was turned into a glittering golden coach and the mice into 6 pure white horses. The lizard became elegant footmen dressed in green velvet. Now you, my dear, said the fairy, turning to Cinderella. A wave of the wand and Cinderella's old apron disappeared, and there she stood in a white dress glittering with golden stars. Her hair was built on top of her head, and it too was sprinkled with stars. On her feet were tiny glass slippers with diamonds in the heel. Enjoy yourself, my dear, said Fairy, but you must leave before midnight, for then my magic ends, and you will be back in your old apron with some mice and lizards at your feet. When Cinderella arrived at the ball, everyone turned to look at this unknown beauty who had arrived so unexpectedly. The prince hurried over to ask her to dance, and then would not dance with anyone else all evening. The sisters were beside themselves with rage, which of course made them look even uglier. Cinderella was enjoying herself so much that she forgot the fairy warning. So she had a terrible fright when the clock began to strike midnight. She turned from the prince with a cry and ran down the stairs of the palace into her carriage and disappeared as suddenly as she had arrived. One of the tiny glass slippers with diamonds sparkling in the heels. Cinderella meanwhile had slipped from her foot as she ran. Cinderella meanwhile had just managed to reach her garden gate when all her finery disappeared. And by the time the sisters arrived home, both in a towering rage, she was sitting quietly by the fire. The next morning, the prince went from house to house looking for the mystery girl whose foot would fit the glass slipper, but no one had feet that small. He reached Cinderella's house where first one sister and then the next tried to squash her big feet into the sleeper. "Please let me try," said a quiet voice from the corner, and Cinderella stepped forward. The sisters just laughed in scorn, but they soon stopped when they saw that the tiny sleeper fitted Cinderella perfectly. There was a sudden swirl of stars, and there in front of Cinderella stood her fairy with a twinkle in her eye and a wand in her hand. In an instant, Cinderella was clothed in a gorgeous dress of cornflower blue silk decorated with pearls. On her feet, she wore white boots with blue tassels. The prince whisked Cinderella off to the palace to meet the king and queen, and the wedding took place the very next day. Cinderella forgave the sisters. She was that sort of girl, but the prince insisted that the sisters spend one day a week working in the palace kitchens just to remind them how horrid they had been to Cinderella. Good night, children.